talk by Meredith Lancaster. My name is Danielle Knapp. I'm the McCosh Associate Curator at the museum. And on behalf of Dr. Jody Seasonwine, our Senior Curator of Western Art, and June Black, our Associate Curator of Academic Programming, all of us in the Western Curatorial Department who've had the pleasure of working with Meredith on several projects over the last 2 years during her time that she's been a graduate student in the Art History Department. We're so happy that you're here to hear her talk about one of the biggest projects she's done with us, this exhibition. When not working on this exhibition, which started out of provenance and permanent collection research that she was doing for us over a year ago, Meredith has also been very active with our studio programs and our K-12 education, serving as a mentor for some of our World of Work students, teaching at O'Hare Elementary. And when she's not doing all of this, she's also completing her master's degree, writing on Marcel Duchamp's curatorial practice, revisiting a little-known exhibition that artist had curated, and the head of the Art History Association, and the head of the Graduate Student Association last year.
Yes, last year.
So we're very happy that she is so generous with her time here. We really could not have accomplished a lot of the great work that's happened in the last 2 years without her involvement. And so I'd like to introduce Meredith, and thank you again for attending her talk.
Thank you. It's a really gracious introduction. So just like Danielle was saying earlier, when June approached me at the beginning of my internship last year, almost immediately when I arrived in Eugene, she asked me, would you be interested in curating an exhibition? And I was horrified, but I said sure, because I've operated under the thought that if it scares you, you should probably just do it. So I did it. So the show, as you see it now, has gone through many different cycles, and the show that as it stands is mostly focused on a life cycle of Christ. So I picked 18 pieces from the museum's permanent collection, and these are the 18 pieces that I felt kind of were the best in dialogue with each other in terms of making the story really easy to follow for every person, if you're an expert or not an expert on Russian or religious imagery. So like I mentioned, the exhibition is organized thematically and also chronologically based on the life of Christ. So it starts at this wall that's behind you. These are generally all images that I would relate to the birth of Christ. And then it comes around the gallery wall, and these are mostly focused on the life of Christ. And then the third wall is focused on Christ's passion, and then it has subsequent power imagery that comes after the resurrection. So for most of the icons in terms of the medium, they're generally all egg tempera on panel, which was a really popular medium. It's egg yolk mixed with pigment. And that is a really great medium to use because it's very durable and it also lasts a very long time. So that's generally what you're going to see in this gallery, with the exception of these two icons, which the one on the top is a 19th century narrative painting, which is actually more done in the style of the Italian Renaissance. So this one's oil on panel, and this one below it is acrylic on panel, and it's a 20th century narrative painting. So I think in order to really understand this exhibition, it's really helpful to know a little bit about icons in general. So I think a lot of us we have maybe a hard time understanding how icons are used because it's pretty foreign. It's not something that a lot of us interact with on a daily basis. So what I think helps, and what has helped a lot of my students in terms of thinking about icons, is you should consider them like windows into heaven. So they're literally something that you're looking into that has no real sense of time or space, because that's not really what's important. What's important is the person or the saint that you're looking at. And also what's important is this concept of theology being translated through imagery. So when you think about them not really the point of them being in any sort of defined time or space, there also isn't any definition of their emotion. They're not meant to be expressive. They're meant to help you be contemplative, and they're meant to be indicators of really important virtues like purity or compassion, patience, particularly when we see icons that have to do with suffering. Like with the crucifixion, for example, you won't see Christ wincing in agony. He looks very peaceful. The other things you'll probably want to think to focus on are love, forgiveness, those kinds of virtues. That's why the expressions are generally pretty solemn, because they're meant to get you thinking about those other things and help you be contemplative while you're praying. Sorry. So when we think about backgrounds, when you consider how complex these images are, you also have to kind of think, well, there must then be rules to how these icons are made. They're not just, I can't just go home and decide I'm going to go paint an icon and it's going to be fabulous, because that's not really how it works. So the iconographer, there's a really long process before the icon even is created, a really long process of contemplation and a really disciplined fasting and prayer. And it's all meant to help the iconographer get to the right headspace where he can be used as a vessel, as God's vessel or the saint's vessel, to paint this beautiful iconic image. Sorry. So when you talk about icons, they're not painted, they're actually written, which is a really fundamental distinction to consider, and that's also how I decided to come up with the title for my exhibition, The Word Became Flesh. And this goes back to biblical text. Everything that most of these titles relate to, it comes directly from biblical text. So in the New Testament, John refers to Jesus as the Word. And also in the original Bible, in Greek translation, there's actually two terms to describe word, and they convey completely different meanings. So one term is rhemas, which literally means written words, and logos, which means it's kind of a conveying of someone's ideas or their thoughts. So when John refers to Jesus as logos, that has some really strong implications to how these icons and how Jesus is thought of as the physical manifestation of the text of the Bible. So hopefully that helps kind of situate where my headspace was at in terms of titling the exhibition. So I think we can move on to individual pieces, because I really want to make sure that you guys get a sense of what you actually are looking at. So I'm going to start over here. Sorry to make you guys shift a little bit. So I'm going to start with this icon, which is entitled The Virgin of Kazan. And when we think about function of icons, this is actually really cool, because a lot of times in churches or cathedrals, like village churches that are really small, they generally have a patron saint. And that patron saint has a feast day, which happens once a year, and it comes on a liturgical calendar. So just like how we celebrate Christmas every single year, it's the same kind of idea. So the Virgin of Kazan has a feast day that comes once a year, and on that day, they take her off of the walls of the cathedral, and they kind of march her through the city. And while she's processing through the city, the villagers have the opportunity to touch or kiss and receive blessings from the Virgin, and then she makes her way, eventually back inside, where there's a huge ceremony, a religious ceremony, a mass, where the blessings kind of continue. So that's a really interesting function of icons. They were also could be used in people's homes for their protection. They were also used as kind of a marker for the beginning of armies. As they were marching into war, they sometimes would, I don't really know what you would call it, they would attach it to something, and then they would kind of march along with it as protection. So they're really interesting. Something iconographically I find really cool, and you'll notice most, if not all, of the icons have this feature. The halo, or the nimbus, actually protrudes out of the frame. So you'll notice that on all, that's a very distinctive features of icons. And if you go back to thinking about how I mentioned icons being windows into heaven, that is a really clear marker, and it's very deliberate, right? The artist or the iconographer is trying to give you a sense of space by having the frame behind the halo, so it almost looks like the Virgin is coming out and giving you this direct blessing. There's also a really fundamental relationship, and you'll see, particularly with these two, that the Virgin is looking directly at us. So, and then her also And this is really important because of Mary being considered the intercessor between us and God, us and heaven. So this connection that we have, this dialogue that you would have as the viewer, her looking directly at you, right in the eyes, and then Christ below her giving his blessing. It's really this cyclical kind of conversation that's happening between the three of us in this really private moment that whatever I'm praying for, she's receiving and then relaying the information to Christ, who is then calling back with a blessing, so to say, and then she's giving that back to me. So then I thought we would talk about this painting. This is the Virgin of the Rosary with Life of Christ. And this one is kind of an oddball. And I think that it's beautiful, no question about it. And I included it in this exhibition because it was a little confusing. We have this iconography in the center, again, of Christ and child in the middle. And then when you get closer, you can really see in the detail, she's actually handing this Dominican nun a rosary. And if you know anything about the Dominican order, they're actually very passionate proponents of the rosary. So this is an exact kind of statement and solidifying the importance of the role of the Dominicans within this larger ritual of praying the rosary. The thing that I find so interesting about this is this text that's on this scroll and this inclusion of this crescent moon, both of which have Arabic on it, ancient Arabic, which is kind of interesting. When I first started looking at it, I don't speak Arabic, so I had a faculty member from the Arabic department, Heather Sweeter, came with her husband, who's a native from Iran, and they couldn't even translate it because it's been wiped off. So probably in cleaning or just over time, the text seems to disappear a little bit. But so this is one that we're still doing a lot of research on because I'm trying to figure out why in the world Catholic imagery would have Arabic. There's a lot of layers that we're still trying to work out. So this one is it's maybe one of my favorites up on the wall because it's so beautiful. The last one that we'll talk about in the Birth of Christ section is the Virgin of the Sign. And this one, again, the halo you still see that feature. It's very faint, but that feature of the halo coming out of the frame. But this is actually the moment of the Annunciation when Mary is receiving the message from the angel Gabriel that she's going to be the person that's going to give birth to the Son of God. So this is her in this moment. This stance is called orans, which is a prayerful pose. And she's basically accepting it. So it's a supplication that we're seeing, and it's kind of that moment. This one actually makes me really want to talk about the interesting concept of icons that are miraculously made. So this is a copy, and the original was at the Church of the Vlakernai, which is in Istanbul in Turkey. And it was said that the original is something that was not made of human hands. So nobody knows how it came into existence. It just one day appeared and it framed itself and it was on the wall and lovely. So that's actually kind of interesting when you think about a copy then, because in the Byzantine and in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, when you copy an icon, it still retains that holiness. Even though it wasn't created in that way, and we may know that, John at the monastery up the street actually painted it or wrote it, we would still operate under the belief that it was just miraculously created. So another cool thing about the original in situ, it actually was originally covered with a veil that would then raise itself. Nobody would touch it. It would just raise itself at the beginning of the day and lower itself at the end of the day. So, and who knows if that's actually true, but just to kind of talk about the mystique of these objects and how interesting they were. Okay, so then following around the corner, this one might be hard to see because it's at an odd angle for you guys, but this one is a depiction of the Nativity. Maybe I'll stand over here. You guys can come closer too if that helps. So this one's a narrative painting, which to differentiate from what we've been looking at, which are icons, this one is a narrative painting. So there's actually a story being told here, and the story is that of the Nativity. Unlike what we're familiar with in the Western tradition, we're used to seeing Christ in a manger, in a stable, that whole situation. In the Eastern tradition, they situate the Nativity in a cave, and that is also a direct biblical reference from the book of James, which is not included in the canonical New Testament as we know it, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's another gospel, the Gospel of James, and James states that Jesus was actually born in a cave. So in the Eastern tradition, they do accept that as a piece of the gospel. So that's where this artistic influence is coming from. Beyond that, we still have the iconographic features that we are familiar with. We have Mary and Jesus. We have the star in the center that was the guiding star. We have the wise men and the shepherd boy and the angels, proclaiming that this miraculous, immaculate conception is occurring and the Christ child is waiting for you. So all of that is the same, but the really distinctive feature and how you know that the person creating it is coming from an Eastern perspective is that it is in a cave. Okay? Oh, so here we are, the largest piece in the gallery, and maybe the most beautiful. I really, when I first saw this painting, it was in a vault with none of the other icons. It was in a completely different spot, and we kind of didn't even think about the fact that it was there, and so when we found it, it was the perfect addition because we needed something really monumental to put up on the wall, and so this was perfect. This is, again, another narrative painting, and it's illustrating the baptism of Christ. And if you're familiar with religious art, you'll notice everything that is considered holy has a halo. A lot of times Christ is represented in a full body halo, which is called mandala, which literally translates to almond-like shape. So what's happening here is we have that full body halo kind of happening, but what's more important is that it's a topographical indicator of where we are in the world. This is actually the River Jordan. So not only is it serving as this body halo, it's also giving us an indication of where we are. So again, he's giving a blessing. There's also this blessing coming up from heaven, from God, or coming down, from heaven. And then we have John the Baptist. Another really cool feature of iconography is that generally, important figures are going to be depicted in exactly the same way, no matter where you are, no matter what you're looking at. So that if you're a person that maybe is illiterate, you would at least know by symbols and signifiers that, oh, this must be John the Baptist. How would I know that? I would know that because John the Baptist is always depicted barefoot. He's also always depicted wearing a full body cloak or a dress that's just made of animal hair because John the Baptist lived in the wild. So it's just another indicator so I would know exactly what the scene is that I'm looking at without any sort of text because I can kind of guesstimate by the important figures that are represented, and then I would know, oh, this is what I'm looking at. Okay? So we're actually going to go around the corner a little bit. Sorry, you guys. Oh, wherever you want to go. Sorry. Okay. So the last wall that we'll talk about are, this is part of the passion and power imagery of Christ. And initially, my first thought about an exhibition was going to be focused on the crucifixion because I've always been really fascinated by these teeny tiny skulls that are on the base of the cross. Unfortunately, there just wasn't enough in the permanent collection to make that a really big statement, but I still wanted to make sure that these were really treated in a monumental way for this exhibition because they're just beautiful. So metal icons, just as an object, are really interesting because unlike these larger icons and narrative paintings, these are really small, and they're also very portable, which is important when you consider where they're coming from. So they're all Russian, and at the beginning of the Russian Revolution in 1667 in Russia, a lot of what are called the old believers, they were all dispelled and persecuted because of some conflicts that were going on between their faiths and that of the patriarch, who decided to make some, in hindsight, I mean, I don't want to say in hindsight, but he made some very small changes to the iconography of the depiction of Christ, that it was just enough and just as important to these old believers that they had to leave Russia. So if you consider, the fact that they have to basically flee their country, they're going to take the things that are the most important, that are small, that they can get away with quickly. So these portable metal icons are just that. They're also very easy to reproduce. They're basically just stamps, so they can be made quickly and efficiently and cost efficiently as well. So the iconography in all of these is exactly the same. You're not going to see very much variation, except for maybe this addition of these sidebars that have bystanders. But for the most part, like I said, the iconography is the same. So you have at the top, there's a little, it's kind of like a sheet, and it's in reference to the Veil of Edessa, which is considered, so there's this whole story that the king of Edessa wanted his very own icon, and he wanted Jesus to come and make it for him. So he sent a messenger to Jesus, and the messenger said, the king wants this. You probably should just give it to him because he's the king. Yeah, because he's the king. Why not? So as the story goes, Jesus says, I'm really busy, but I'm busy like saving people and, like having followers and being really cool. So what I can do for you is wipe my face on this towel, and then you can give that to him. So what appears on the towel that the messenger then takes back to Edessa is an actual imprint of his face. So that's what you see at this top corner, the Veil of Edessa. Then we have on the top crossbar 2 angels. And then right here is actually a sign in abbreviated Russian that says Pontius Pilate, and then right underneath it says Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, like we know from the Gospels. Then in the second crossbar, this is where Christ's hands are actually nailed to the cross, but there's also some really interesting imagery of a sun and a moon, which is an exact reference to the book of Joel, where the prophet Joel says upon the second coming of Christ, the moon will turn blood red. So that's what you're meant to kind of remember and think about when you see the sun and the moon on this second bar. As we move along the middle, to the side of Jesus are the lance and then the sponge, which, and if we know from biblical text, the lance was used to pierce Christ's side, and the sponge was soaked in vinegar and offered to him to drink. So those are included here. And the slanted bar is particularly interesting because, again, we're offered a topographical reference to where we are in the world. So if you look really closely, you can see an exterior city wall. So clearly, the city that is being depicted here is Jerusalem. And at the time, it was illegal to have burials or deaths or executions or anything with dead people. If you're sick, you got to get out of here. If you're dead, you got to get out. So all of that would happen outside of Jerusalem. So it's another indicator that this is happening outside of the city walls. As we get lower, again, we see this skull, which is in reference to the skull of Adam, who is said to have also been buried at Golgotha, which is the same place where Christ was crucified, which solidifies this idea of typology, where Adam is a Christ type. So Adam's existence predates or prefigures the existence of Jesus Christ later. So in a sense, they're kind of the same. They're like each other. So that's why that inclusion of the skull is really important. So moving on a little bit further after the resurrection, we have these images that appear of Christ in power. And these are referred, the iconography here is called Christ Pantocrator, which literally means Christ all-powerful. So unlike the Christ that we see in the baptism in that painting, who looks very humble, he's nude, this Christ is not any of that. He's kind of scary. And that's the point. That's exactly the point. We're supposed to be fearful of him because he is all-powerful. A lot of times in many medieval churches, the Christ Pantocrator is the image that would have been seen in the apse, which is directly above the altar, almost in a way to say, I'm watching you. So that's kind of what's happening. That's the emotionality that's supposed to be evoked when looking at the Christ Pantocrator. Another feature you'll notice, again, with the halo, while it is coming out, this halo is actually a little bit different. And this is called a cruciform nimbus, because if you look really closely, there's actually a shape of a cross on his nimbus, which you will never see on any other saint's halo, because that cross is indicative of the Trinity. So he's only ever going to be the one that has that feature. The other thing that is generally always shown in a Christ Pantocrator is he's usually seated in a throne, or at the very least, if you're not seeing his whole body, you'll get kind of the impression that he is sitting down, and he's always going to be holding a Bible. Whether it's open or closed, that'll vary, but if it is open, it's generally the Book of John. Here, it's an abbreviation of the Book of John, and the Russian, I actually had a lot of help from a contemporary Russian iconographer named Olga Volshkova, and she actually has a show that'll be up here after mine comes down, and she actually helped me with all of the translations, but this one was impossible to translate because it is so abbreviated, it just doesn't even make any sense. So that's just a little tidbit. So as I kind of alluded to with the old believers, the one thing that they changed, that the patriarch changed, was this hand gesture. So if you notice, so here, it's like this. Yeah, it's kind of like this. This is the gesture, the blessing gesture that Christ is making, as opposed to this. That little change is what caused this entire kerfuffle, and people were being murdered, and they were fleeing Russia, and they were going all over the world. And you may not know this, but the largest community of old believers is actually in Woodburn, Oregon, of all places. So I wouldn't recommend just driving through, because they're not, it's not Disneyland, but they are there. And there's actually been a book written about them, and they're fascinating people, and they are they feel very passionately about these small little details, and they still live in an Orthodox way. The last feature in this wall is something that has been here. If you have come to the museum a lot, this wall generally stays the same, and it serves the purpose as an iconostasis wall, which in a medieval church, an iconostasis wall would be way bigger than this. So if you could imagine a wall, floor to ceiling, maybe all the way to the end of the other gallery, covered in horizontal rows of icons, just covered. This is a very, very light interpretation of that, but that's basically what the purpose of this wall is, because it would be a feature in any Orthodox church. What is the same, because obviously we don't have a whole lot of saints represented up here, but what is the same on an iconostasis wall is the portal will always be in the center. These are called the royal doors. This is a reproduction. And then to the sides of the royal doors would always be the Virgin Mary and a Christ Pantocrator. That is, doesn't matter what else you do with the arrangement of the saints above, but what has to exist are these two features. Okay, so that's pretty much all that I have.
Do you have time to take some questions, if there are any questions from you?
Sure. Oh, yeah.
So you had said that the artist who writes the icons is sort of understood as a vessel for the Holy Spirit to actually create the image.
Yes.
Do you happen to know anything about the status of that person? Were they, elevated because of that privilege, or?
I don't think that they were necessarily elevated. A pretty common practice in a monastery was to be kind of wrapped up in reading and writing and creating icons. So it's just part of their existence at a monastery. There might have been some monks that were probably more artistically inclined than the others, and maybe those would be the ones that were actually being the iconographers. But it was a part of their just everyday, it was an important part of their everyday existence and of their purpose.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you. Thank you.